When we come, do not run. Face us in the most sacred temple of Khorne. Offer your lives, your blood, your skulls to his realm and throne. Fight us and let us turn the earth, sun, and the very skies, the most sacred of all colors. And when the sun rises once more, it shall behold naught but crimson fields. The Tome of Sacred Blood, Chapter 1, Verse 1. One of the sacred texts of the Crimson Dawn. History. The Crimson Dawn is a chaos cult dedicated to the blood god Khorne. Amongst the various cults dedicated to the blood god, the Crimson Dawn is unique due to their more religious and spiritual nature regarding Khorne and their views of him. The cult has dedicated priests, texts, rituals and rites regarding the blood god. This is due to the origins of the cult and its creators. The cult was originally created by one of the brass deacons of the Apostles of Carnage, a warband of word-bearers dedicated solely to Khorne. It originates on the former imperial feudal world of Perspia. While technologically the world wasn't the most advanced, its people had always had a warlike nature to themselves. They were aggressive, but controlled their rage. It was this fact that drew the eye of brass deacon Ilkheim to this world, seeing it as the perfect place to create a new force for his warband, as they had suffered grievous losses not long before. Agents of Ilkheim were dispatched onto the world to bring its people into the embrace of Khorne. As expected, it didn't take long for the cult to spread across Perspia, with only a few cities resisting the conversion. Deciding it was finally time to put the new cult to a true test, Ilkheim ordered his agents to help the cult start an uprising against the planetary ruler. The war was bloody, but dealt with swiftly, as the remaining cities did not possess nearly enough manpower to stop the cult. In the end, it had only taken the cult 8 weeks to conquer the world and become its rulers. It was then that the Apostles of Carnage arrived on Perspia to collect the reward of Ilkheim's labor. To the cult, the Apostles were the heralds of Khorne, and so they left with all due haste, ready, in their minds at least, to take on new enemies across the galaxy in the name of the Blood God. However, they were far from being a truly capable force. They were large, yes, but undisciplined and uncontrolled. Thus, the leader of the Apostles decided to call in a favor with a fellow son of Lorgar. Calling upon the services of Jika the Converter, the cult was provided with converted Imperial Guard officers and commanders to train the cult. The training was brutal, and many had perished during it, but those that remained were truly a force to be feared. The warband had then provided them with equipment to match, many of their ships being turned into forges in the past to fuel the Apostles in their conquest. Their industry was now turned to arming the cult to war. With training and equipment, the cult was finally utilized by the Apostles in conflict, and it was on the world of Kurvikesh that they proved their worth and effectiveness. Kurvikesh was a world that was taken over by the forces of Slaanesh at the time, and being loyal servants of Khorne, the Apostles and their new mortal followers would not abide their existence. Making a mass landing upon the world, the cult was immediately set upon by the forces of Slaanesh, made up primarily out of demons and some Chaos Marines of the Emperor's children. Even with these forces set against them, the cult had made staggering progress, crushing the servants of Slaanesh wherever they walked, their skulls and blood offered in bloody rituals to their lord as supplications. The forces of the cult did not stop until every enemy of the world was killed by their hands, including the leader of the Emperor's Children force, who was crippled with the heavy weapons of the cult and then decapitated by one Kritis Rock. It was also during this war that the cult had gained its name, as when the sun arose upon the world, it, the skies and the ground were all turned crimson from the blood spilled, and it was then that the Crimson Dawn was truly born. Ever since then, the Crimson Dawn and the Apostles of Carnage have fought alongside one another in numerous conflicts against servants of the Emperor, Zenus, and even other warriors of Khorne at times. The cult had gained a reputation across the higher echelons of the Imperium over time as a truly capable enemy and not just a rabble of screaming and mad lunatics, although the cult has plenty of those in their ranks. Whenever the Crimson Dawn goes to battle, the enemy is aware that they are coming as the priests of the cult scream the holy passages from their books across the entire Vox network or through powerful speakers that can be heard many miles away. The forces of the cult make no attempt to hide their coming or presence on the battlefield, or when coming to one, for they always want to be in the center of the heaviest fighting. Only there does the cult believe they can offer the most skulls and blood for Khorne. The number of conflicts the cult has taken part in are too many to name, but out of all of them, there are two more notable conflicts they have fought in that are truly worth of note: the War of Blood and the Scarlet March. The War of Blood was a conflict between the forces of the Crimson Dawn and Blood Pact within the Athatian system located in the Imperium Nihilus. The reason for the conflict is not known to others besides those that partook in it. However, it is speculated it was either over resources the two forces needed, or simply to make the blood flow for Khorne. In either case, the war between the two forces was a truly bloody and brutal affair. The system was completely ruined by the conflict between the two forces and ended up being nothing more than a barren red wasteland. During the war, it was noted by the members of both sides that the two forces were quite similar in some ways. Both are highly organized, disciplined, and ruthless armies of the Blood God that haven't turned into deranged berserkers, at least yet. It was also during this conflict that one of the leaders of the Crimson Dawn ascended into the ranks of demonhood. The former holder of the butcher position in the cult's leadership, Makrik Shah, now known as Zendrazur the Ruthless. Thanks to this, and the forces of the cult achieving several victories over key locations in the Athatian system, the Blood Pact was pushed back and eventually routed from the system by the Crimson Dawn, although the losses of the cult were quite severe. Since then, if the two forces ever met again, it would only take seconds at most for the two to start attacking one another. What exactly the Crimson Dawn had managed to claim from this war, besides the tides of blood and skulls, is not known, but it is assumed by most to be resources to fuel their further war effort against the rest of the galaxy. It is the most likely conclusion, seeing as not too long after the War of Blood, the cult had bolstered their armored core significantly, now even including a Baneblade super heavy battle tank that was taken from the forces of the Blood Pact during the war. The Scarlet March was a much larger affair for the cult, for alongside them and the Apostles of Carnage were a number of other forces of the Blood God. The Steel-Blooded, the Hounds of Doom, the Brazen Forgers, and two armies of Demon Princes of Khorne, the Infernal Host of Magrathur and the Butcher Horde of Zendrazur. The goal of this mighty cohort was to claim a powerful Khornate artifact located on the world of Miklay Prime. The artifact was in the possession of the Xanthite Inquisitor named Galtrus Ferdronir, who had arrived into the sector to claim and take it to his order to study and possibly use against the forces of chaos. The conflict was spread across the Matrius sector within the borders of the Imperium Nihilus, the sector itself including 8 systems which were under attack by a horde of various Slaaneshi forces led by Jusian the Magnificent of the Emperor's Children. Alongside them, there were also the remaining Imperial forces in the sector, which included several regiments of the Imperial Guard, 2 companies of the Silver Arachnids chapter, and several garrisons of the Red Legion. With the arrival of the forces of Khorne, the sector had turned into a 3-way war between the various forces. The forces of the Crimson Dawn were mainly deployed within the sectors in Hadrian and Balkushian systems to hunt down the remaining forces of the Imperial Guard and to draw as much non-Astarte forces of the Slaaneshi horde to themselves as possible. The 3 systems became like a microcosm of the larger conflict as the forces battled each other. The cult, while initially successful in suppressing and hunting down the forces of the Imperial Guard, were never able to fully rid them from the 3 systems due to the massive numbers of the various forces of Slaanesh that came to destroy them. In the sector system, the war had turned into one of attrition and butchery, as several of the system's worlds were turned into bastions of the remnants of the Imperial Guard and a garrison of the Red Legion stationed there. While the Crimson Dawn was able to claim 4 of the system's worlds, the rest were firmly in the hands of the Guard. No forces of Slaanesh were able to enter the system due to the relentless hunting of the naval elements the cult was provided by the Apostles and the remnants of the Imperial fleet. Eventually, the forces of the Crimson Dawn were able to land forces upon the other worlds, but that did not mean things would get easier, for their forces were faced with the task of conquering essentially world-sized fortresses. The war for sector system would last nearly the entirety of the Scarlet March conflict, and would eventually be concluded when the forces of the Steel-Blooded came to aid the Crimson Dawn to finally destroy the Imperial bastions. In the Hadrian system, the war had a much swifter tone to it, as the majority of the enemy forces were made out of cults of Slaanesh. The conflicts between the Crimson Dawn and the horde of Slaaneshi cults usually devolved into chases across the world and guerrilla warfare, which made it harder for the forces of the Crimson Dawn to hunt down their enemies. In the end, the cult had to change their tactics to win, and so started to deploy mass numbers of fast technicals and other more experimental vehicles to finally be able to hunt down and destroy the forces of Slaanesh. The War of the Hadrian system would end after nearly 5 months and would result in the destruction of 2 worlds in the system. One destroyed by the forces of the Imperium, who detonated the nuclear bombs buried within the world's crust, tearing it apart. The other being swallowed up by the warp, due to a ritual of one of the many Slaaneshi forces, and even though the world itself likely still exists in the warp, for the purposes of the conflict, it was declared as destroyed, as it no longer could be claimed by anyone. The Balkusian system was by far the messiest affair of the 3, as all 3 factions held considerable forces in the system due to the presence of the Forge World of Icarus II, which could produce massive numbers of artillery, vehicles, and ammunition for whichever force would manage to claim it. And, as expected, all 3 factions wanted to claim the world for their goals, alongside some minor objectives, such as the resource-rich world of Icarus I or the hive world of Percutris. Each of the gathered forces held some presence on each world within the system, making the conflict a very difficult thing to manage for all of them. The borders on each world would change constantly each day, yet none was able to fully push off the other from the worlds. The battlegrounds of the Icarus II in particular were things of nightmare to any soldier. Miles upon miles were covered in blood, gore, burning wrecks and wandering demons that had manifested. In such a situation, friendly fire was unavoidable, and with the amount of blood and warp being present, many parts of the gathered forces on Icarus II went into a berserk state, wandering the vast world in many scattered murder packs, and not all of those were of the Crimson Dawn. Many of the Imperial and even some Slaaneshi forces were taken over by berserk rage, causing even more confusion as supposed allies attacked one another in massive fights. The war for the Balkusian system was in the end decided by the arrival of Zendraza, who came to aid his former army with his own cohort of demons. Overall, the war lasted almost 14 months before the forces of the Crimson Dawn finally managed to claim the system and its resources for the forces of the Scarlet March. Besides these 3 systems, the forces of the Crimson Dawn were scattered in smaller numbers across many other worlds of the Matrius sector, aiding the forces of Khorne in their conquest and destruction of their foes. Their forces helped in conquest of the high world Endremus and the destruction of the Slaaneshi templecraft Perfection Manifested, of Giseon's own warband, the banishment of Ishmaelius the Immaculate back into the warp, the claiming of the Menkarian space station, and so on. The Crimson Dawn would of course also take part in the final conflict of the campaign, where the forces of the Scarlet March claimed the final world of the Matrius sector, the fortress world of Miklay Prime, and alongside it the Khornate artifact known as the Scepter of Blood. Currently, the forces of the cult and the Scarlet March at large are rebuilding and bolstering their numbers in preparation for the continuation of their bloody crusade. Wherever the forces of the mighty cohort might head next, one thing is certain. The Crimson Dawn will always accompany them across the stars in the name of blood, war, skulls, and Khorne. Organization. The Crimson Dawn organization is based off of the Imperial Guard hierarchy with some modifications for the cult. The cult is equivalent to the ranks within the Guard. Here are the ranks and their Guard equivalents. Malkiar, Guardsman. Melkiar, Corporal. Molkior, Sergeant. Salkiar, Lieutenant. Selkiar, Captain. Solkior, Major. Halkiar, Colonel. Besides these ranks, there are also several special ranks within the cult to represent some other individuals within it. Muliarchs, translated as mad, are the berserkers of the cult, a collection of the mad and most bloodthirsty maniacs who have completely lost their sanity. They serve as the cannon fodder of the Crimson Dawn to use against their enemies and to make them think the cult is much less of a threat than they think. They are most often seen wielding flails of various designs in battle. Belkiars, translated roughly as preacher, serve as a mixture of priests and commissars within the cult, using their powers of oratory to bolster the morale of the forces of the cult when in battle and to inspire them to even greater feats of bloodshed and murder in the name of Khorne. They are also known to often replace their vocal cords with powerful voxcasters and read from one of the many holy books of the cult during battle. Belkiars also serve a special purpose within the cult, looking out for potential aspirants for the Apostles of Carnage from amongst their numbers. They are most often seen using a wooden or iron staff in one hand and a chainsword, a chain axe or mace in the other. Delkiars, translated roughly either as compiler or surgeon, these individuals serve as the doctors, of a sort, to the cult. While they are known to save some of their number from dying to wounds and such, but more often that is a secondary goal of theirs. Their main purpose is to harvest organs and equipment that could still be used by the Crimson Dawn. While the cult does possess forges within the spacecraft, they are not ones to leave still useful equipment just lying on the battlefield. It is their belief that as long as a weapon can kill, then it must be brought from the battlefield, fixed and used once more for its sole goal. As for why they harvest organs, that is known only to the Delkiars themselves, but some speculate they are taken and then given to the Kulkiars. Kulkiars, translated roughly as knight, they are the most elite forces of the cult and are often used when the apostles are not present or able to arrive soon. These individuals undergo painful procedures under the scalps and saws of the Delkiars to bolster their physical abilities and are eventually placed within a crude version of power armor the cult has managed to create. Becoming something akin to a Demi-Astartes, they are monsters on the battlefield. Not as strong or fast as full-fledged Chaos Marine, but still much stronger than a baseline human. Most often, they are used as heavy-hitting frontline units or stormtroopers against whatever enemy the cult might be facing on the battlefield. However, this power comes with a cost, as those that undergo the procedures can never take off their armor, as it also acts as their life support system, but there are many cases where the armor ends up, devouring or otherwise hurting one or more of their organs in battle. Above all of these ranks are the so-called Helkiars, the generals and the leaders of the Crimson Dawn. Made up of 8 individuals, they are the ones who lead the forces of the cult in battle and plan their strategies against the enemy they are currently facing. Each one who is a part of this group has earned their position through blood, pain and sacrifice. They are, all of them, ruthless warlords who are not to be underestimated despite being baseline humans, for the most part at least. As stated, there are 8 individuals leading the cult, and thus there are 8 positions. It can only be held by one individual, as dictated by the tenets and commands of the apostles. The positions are smith, preacher, butcher, knight, strategist, commander, warlord, and champion. 5 of these ranks, smith, preacher, butcher, knight, and commander, are related to individual branches of the cult, while the remaining 3, strategist, warlord, and champion, serve as support and additional leaders to help the cult's forces in battle. The forces of the cult recruit either from worlds already claimed by the forces of chaos or, much more often, from worlds that they have fought on or are still fighting on. Their new recruits are also often trained on said world if a war is still going on. This is also used to willow out the weak and leave only those truly worthy to serve the Bloodguard and the cult in its ranks. Not long after, it is decided whether the newly inducted will join the ranks of the Muliarchs or Malkiars, depending on how they performed and, more importantly, what they did on the battlefield itself. Should they show signs of high aggression, being easily irritated, and high lust for blood and slaughter, then they are sent to join the ranks of Muliarchs. Should they, however, show that they still possess at least some of their sanity and are capable of following orders, then they are sent to join the Malkiars, and to go through further training and many sermons of the cult's priests to be turned into a true soldier of the Crimson Dawn. The cult is able to arm itself to a relatively high standard, for the forces of chaos at least. The standard weapons of the Crimson Dawn soldier include a variant of the Necromundon pattern lasgun, Sitka pattern autogun, Utishar pattern las pistol, Kiktar pattern auto pistol, a melee weapon of some kind, usually a chainsword or chain axe, and a ritual knife. Alongside these weapons, some forces of the cult, mainly the Kolkiars, have access to heavy weapons and power swords and axes. The higher one rises within the cult hierarchy, the better equipment they get, and eventually more men under their command. The cult is known to possess armored cores within its ranks, mainly made out of technicals and captured Imperial Guard Leman Russ battle tanks of various designs. Over time, they have also managed to acquire a Baneblade super heavy battle tank and several Malcador pattern heavy tanks. The most commonly used are of course the various technicals, since they are cheap to make and easy to maintain. Should the situation show the enemy to be harder to defeat than anticipated, then the cult will deploy its Leman Russ tanks and, in the worst cases, the Baneblade and the Malcador tanks. Notable figures. There are several notable figures within the Crimson Dawn cult, most of which are Helkiars, who lead the cult, but there are a few who became known across the cult even though they never possessed one of the 8 titles. The Bloodsmith, Ritus. Originally an adept of Adeptus Mechanicus, Ritus never managed to rise through the ranks of his Forge world due to his radical ideas and mind, which have earned him several attempts on his life by his fellow tech priests. It would only be the arrival of Jika the Converter and a force of the Apostles of Carnage that we would finally be able to rise, though no longer within the ranks of the Mechanicus. It didn't take long before Jika managed to convert Ritus to the beliefs of the Apostles and for him to become a part of its leadership, taking the title of Smith. Now, Ritus is a powerful heretic within the forces of chaos, forging many tools of death and destruction in the name of Khorne, for which he would eventually be blessed by the Blood God, and his hands became covered in the fires of Khorne's own forges, allowing him to forge even more powerful weapons himself. Ritus still holds the title of Smith within the Crimson Dawn, and it is unlikely he will lose it anytime soon. The Bishop, Iliak Durak. The current holder of the Preacher title within the Crimson Dawn, Durak is the leader of the Biliarchs and one of the most feared individuals of the cult. Rising within its ranks thanks to his ruthlessness and power of oration, he eventually claimed the former holder of the Preacher title and defeated him in combat, keeping his skull as a trophy within his private chambers. While he may not look too intimidating when entering into battle, you should never make that mistake when facing him, for despite his looks, he is a devilishly fast combatant, using his staff and mace to great effect in fights. He also possesses great intellect, and it is said if he wasn't chosen to become a Belkiar, he would have likely risen to the title of Warlord or Strategist. The Dreadful Butcher, Kark Ret. Former second-in-command of the infamous Markrik Shah. After his ascension into demonhood during the War of Blood, Kark easily assumed the role and title of Butcher within the cult's ranks. A man of large stature, he is the definition of his title when in battle. Being the one to fight most often on the battlefield out of the 8 Helkiars alongside Tikas, he leads the massive hordes of his fellow berserkers into battle from the very front each time, committing such acts of butchery in his life that he was eventually blessed by Khorne and given 2 demon flails from the Blood God's own realm. Known as the Teeth of Khorne, he wields them to great effect in combat, able to tear apart his enemies into shreds with ease. The Crimson Knight, Kritus Rock. The first of the Kalkias to have been created, he is what every warrior who undergoes the procedure to become a Kalkia hopes to be. Unlike the rest of his brethren, the armor Kritus has is of much finer making, said to not malfunction like the cruder variations of the rest possess. It is not known what process was used to make his armor, but it cannot be studied, as the armor had fully melded with his body, being effectively his skin now. Alongside Durak and Kerr, Kritus possesses a mighty intellect of his own. Being able to utilize the strengths of his Kolkia brethren to its full potential, it is the reason he holds the title of Knight. The Fallen Inquisitor, Morlus Kerr. A former Xanthite of the Imperial Inquisition, even before his fall to Khorne, Kerr was said to have been a warmonger and willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve victory, even by the standards of Xanthites. Eventually, however, he went too far and was declared a renegade and traitor by the Imperium and was being hunted down at every turn. It is not known when he crossed paths with the Crimson Dawn, but it is known that he had ended up joining them, claiming the title of Strategist. As ironic as it may sound, it was after he joined the forces of the Crimson Dawn that he was finally able to temper his warmonger tendencies and was fully able to use his mind. Now, however, it would be against the forces of the Imperium and any enemy that would dare to cross paths with the cult. The first of 8, Rigus Justak. Said to have been the first of the commanders to have been converted by Jika and delivered to the Apostles of Carnage, it was he who had helped to train the forces of the Crimson Dawn and led them during the battles of Krvikesh against the forces of Slaanesh. He has managed to retain the title of commander ever since then, and none had dared to challenge it for it in a long time, as any who have done so before ended up dying by his hand. It was during one of these challenges for his position that he ended up losing his right hand to his enemy. He had it replaced by a captured power fist taken from an Imperial sergeant. This resulted later in those Molekils under his command to wear iron gauntlets on their right hands to symbolize their status in the cult. Another thing of note is that Rigus, alongside writers, are at least 2 original members of the 8. The Black Coat Hunter, Murak Kar. Holding the title of Warlord, Murak Kar is one of the 3 Helkiars who doesn't represent any particular part of the Crimson Dawn itself. He is the most secretive of the 8, not talking much about anything, be it his past or what he plans. What is known for certain is that whenever the cult fights against the Imperial Guard, Murak is always after the commissars accompanying the regiment. The reason for this is not known by anyone save Murak himself. The Scarlet Herald, Tikas. The last member of the 8, Tikas, holds the title of champion and is also one of the 3 Helkiars who doesn't represent any part of the cult. As stated before, Tikas, like the Butcher, spent most of his time on the battlefield. Though unlike the Butcher, Tikas usually leads the more sane forces of the Crimson Dawn in battle, looking like a dark version of heroes of old Earth. Tikas is described as a dark beacon to the forces of the cult, able to rally and lead them no matter the situation. It is also rumored that due to the ever-growing number of skulls offered to the Skull Throne, he will ascend into demonhood soon. Zendrazir, the Ruthless. Before ascending to demonhood, the demon prince Zendrazir was known as Makrik Shah and was the former butcher of the Helkiars. Most of the information of his mortal life was lost, and what little is known is now only remembered by Karkret, due to him being his former second-in-command. After his ascension into demonhood, Markrek, now known as Zendrazir the Ruthless, had left the Crimson Dawn and ventured across the realm of Khorne, gathering a mighty butcher horde under his command, with which he had fought uncounted battles on the Blood God's border reaches. Before he joined the Scarlet March, Zendrazir was summoned within the Materium on a few occasions by other Khanate cults. Each time he was summoned, whatever world he was on fell to his demonic army and rage, though it was just as often as he was banished back into the Immaterium. Most of his banishments were the result of the forces of Slaanesh, rather than the Imperium, which only increased his hate for the slaves of the Dark Prince. It is known that he had also taken part in the so-called Renegade Crusade, led by Jika the Converter and several other outcast wordbearers, although his exact role in it remains a mystery to this day, as does much of the crusade itself.